Hello. Good morning, afternoon, evening. My name is Josh. I'm Ecosystem Strategy Lead with Tidelift. I am here today with Isabel Costa, a maintainer that we have had some great conversations about new contributors and how new contributors can help maintainers. And I am looking forward to having a conversation today about Hacktoberfest and what it means to make a meaningful contribution to open source projects, especially if you're new to open source or new to a given project. Before we dig in, because I know it is just now the top of the hour, give folks a few moments to join us. Before we dig in, let's meet our guest today. Isabel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So thank you, Josh. I'm Isabel. I'm from Portugal. In fact, I'm right now in Portugal, but I live in the UK. I work as a software engineer, and on the side, I participate in open source, whether it's through NETB open source or through other communities and people that I try to encourage getting started with open source and just getting their flow in it and not feel so intimidated. And that's about it. That's a very just presentation.
That's perfect. And that is exactly why we're here talking with you about this subject. So I suspect that most people are aware of what Hacktoberfest is, but just in case, Isabel, do you want to share what you know about what Hacktoberfest is, just to level set for everyone?
Yes, so Hacktoberfest is this event that happens during the month of October. It has happened at least the last 3 years and probably has more, but I just remember getting to know this event a couple of years ago. And usually is to encourage people to contribute to open source during that month for projects and communities that choose to participate in it. So far, I have participated mostly as a maintainer, where I try to facilitate issues for people to be contributors in Oktoberfest. And one funny thing of this event is that as a contributor, if you get 4 pull requests that are valid, you may get a t-shirt by the end of it. And I've seen a couple of people wearing that t-shirt. I also kind of want that t-shirt, but it's just a nice event that really gets people looking at open source during that month. It's where I see the most activity from a lot of communities I'm in, and everyone usually knows about Oktoberfest.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I learned, I had not known how long it had been going on myself until one of the organizers, Daniel at DigitalOcean, reached out earlier this year. This is their 8th year running Hacktoberfest, which is just phenomenal. And it's such a great opportunity to really drive focus on open source and incentivize people to, make those first contributions. And one of the challenges that can come with that is when a program is incentivizing open source contribution through, say, extrinsic motivation, like a t-shirt, sometimes you don't always get the highest quality of contributions. Sometimes it can be a little difficult as a maintainer with the flood of contributions that come in of varying qualities. And so one of the things that happened last year was there were a lot of maintainers who felt a little frustrated because Hacktoberfest was, it wasn't an opt-in situation. It was just sort of like everybody in open source is participating. And so everybody in open source is getting this flood of pull requests. And frankly, not every maintainer or project is set up to receive that kind of thing. So I really appreciated last year when they changed the program to be an opt-in situation so that projects can choose to participate in Hacktoberfest if they're ready to receive that kind of thing. Now, that was a big change, and that was a really important one. we're here today talking about what does it mean to make a meaningful first contribution, or what does it mean to make a meaningful contribution at all to a project? Because what we would like to do is help people get a sense of uh, how to participate without making life harder on a maintainer. So we have a series of questions here that we're gonna roll through. This is not a scripted conversation though, so we may deviate from the questions we cooked up before this. We're just gonna see where this conversation takes us and hopefully create some value for the folks who are tuned in. So, the first thing that we wanted to talk about is really why do people contribute to open source? Isabel, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I can speak mostly about my reasonings, which actually have evolved over time. But actually also, I remember this work colleague, he came in with this Hacktoberfest t-shirt, and we talked a little bit about his participation on it. And he actually was motivated about giving back to the open source community. He doesn't do much participation outside of the Oktoberfest, but he wanted to, at least during that event, to give back. Regarding my motivations, when I started thinking about open source, I thought a lot about, okay, there's this concept of open source contributing to other projects. And I was studying in college, but I felt I needed to do something more to improve my skills and also to get a little bit more acquainted with the developer community. So initially, I thought a lot about improving my skills, but also my portfolio and all that jazz. And I eventually started participating through 24 pull requests, which is similar to Oktoberfest. I don't think there's a t-shirt giving exercise there. But first I wanted to get to know, what is this open source? I don't know, and I know that people feel intimidated by it, so am I. But eventually evolved since I started getting into this open source community concept, which started with Google Summer of Code. And since then, when I started discovering that open source was much more than code, that, if I don't feel patience or if I don't want to contribute with code on my spare time, I can contribute with something else. So it evolved for also, like, so many people are intimidated by open source, and I don't want them to feel like that, because I now know that it shouldn't be so intimidated. It depends on the project, on the communities. So it eventually evolved to, okay, I want to help others get started. And with all of these, I eventually learn a lot from people that I contribute with, people that just do pull requests and I learned something new. So I can see there's a lot of types of motivations here, right? Some that are regarding my professional career, but other than that is related to giving back to the community. And in this case, in my mind, me helping other people contribute, it's like giving back to the community, because other people will bring up the perspectives that I don't have. Perhaps there's people who like to touch hardware, or people who want to contribute to social causes through open source. And also, so far I have seen in the communities, that it's usually the same. People want to also get involved with open source because they know it's this concept that it may seem scary, but it's also good for them, can be good for them, and also for the open source community in general. So yeah, those are my thoughts on it. What about you,
Yeah,
Josh?
for me, the first time I contributed to open source, it was both because I found myself unemployed and had spare time on my hands. And I had really I had been a freelance web developer for like a decade using Drupal and WordPress. And it actually had not dawned on me how novel it was that there was these sophisticated projects that I could use and modify and make a living off of. So when I had that downtime and that realization struck, like, oh, this is a community effort, and I have been making a career on this. there's a sense of obligation to give back. And so that's how I got started. And I know that motivations really vary, right? There's the sense of reciprocity of like, let me give back to this community that I've been benefiting from. There's the resume building side of it, where if you have the free time, the privilege of contributing to open source, then you can have public work product, and that can act as proof of your technical expertise and your ability to be a team player and to work with people across time zones and all that good stuff. But then there are those intrinsic motivations of when we did our Titleist maintainer survey this year, the number one reason that people said that they now this was about being an open source maintainer, which is sort of a next level up from contribution. The number one motivation was making a positive impact on the world. And so, it may be getting a stipend through an internship like program with Outreachy. It could be a t-shirt through Hacktoberfest, or sometimes it's just, hey, this is fun, or this is meaningful. So, people come to open source for all manner of reasons. And one thing that I know, somebody who formerly helped administer the Google Summer of Code program, was that the projects, the maintainers, sometimes were circumspect about the value of these programs for their projects. Because yes, they loved bringing in new contributors. But what I heard oftentimes was, well, these contributors don't always stick around. And I think one of the real values of these programs is that, even if contributors don't necessarily stick around, a contribution, a drive-through contribution, as they're sometimes called, can still be really valuable. And even if that contributor doesn't stick around, the fact that the project has had to prepare themselves to take on new contributors means suddenly there's documentation that exists, there's a culture of mentorship they've had to start cultivating. It ends up being a really healthy thing for the project community. What I would love to spend a little time talking about, now that we've sort of talked a bit about motivations, before we talk about the sort of the maintainer wish list and what maintainers are looking for from contributors, I'd like to explore, what does it mean to make a meaningful contribution to an open source project? Isabel, do you want to take a crack at that?
I'll try my best. I was still thinking about the programs things, but we can speak later about that. But in terms of meaningful contribution, it's hard to define it, right? Because sometimes people may do little small contributions in terms of, maybe it's just one line code change. But I had a person tell me the other day about this joke. I don't want to tell the joke, but just the idea that sometimes one line of change can change a lot in a project. Can fix a big bug. But sometimes there's also this type of contribution that I think it's well known about, sometimes fixing typos. And they may seem small, but for example, a typo in a documentation, it can really make it easier for somebody else who reads the documentation after not get confused with what they're reading and get the full picture of what the documentation wants to transmit. So I wouldn't say that those are not meaningful contributions. There's meaning in all contributions. Otherwise, why do the change? But a couple of things I think in terms of contributions. For example, in the projects that I maintain at NEWB, I create issues of things that come up to my mind. But sometimes there's things that sometimes a contributor has a new perspective on the project, and not just new perspective, but perhaps expertise that I don't have. For example, the other day, someone contributing to Hacktoberfest, they contributed to an issue of theirs, but they also created an issue that they ended up solving that had to do with accessibility on a website. And that's really not my forte. So I would not think about the capitalization of menu text letters. I would not think about it. And when they came up with that issue, I was like, I just learned something new. I'm so excited with this. And not just me, but anyone who comes to this repository and takes a look at the issues and perhaps digs into the pull requests can learn something new as well, in case they don't know the same thing I didn't. So creating issues when you see something that the maintainers don't, or that the rest of the community doesn't. Also, another one that I think about is tests. Usually software developers, they might write tests for their features, but they might not write a test for every single edge case, every single potential scenario that the feature could break. So that's also a contribution that, at least for me as a maintainer, when I see it, it can be very easy for me to review and still adds a ton of value to the project, because it's improving the test coverage. It's covering a potential scenario that wasn't accounted for initially. So I see that as a very valuable contribution. And again, issues might not be created for these test cases, but if you come in with a new perspective and you look at the test and you want to do a contribution that, okay, I want to do air quotes small contribution in terms of, let me look at the test, let me add something here, and I know I'll make the project better for it. So that's also a meaningful contribution in my mind.
Yeah.
And as I said before, any documentation change. Documentation, sometimes I may write documentation for a project that I'm creating, but I already have a lot of preconceived, a lot of context that other people who didn't start the project as I did might not have. And again, that's where other people come in. They may see the setup for a project and wait a minute, I need to do this step because I had to Google and I had this issue. And I did this step and now this works fully. And they can add that new thing to the documentation. So that's totally meaningful for me. And of course, issues that are already created, they're potentially created for some reason if they're validated by maintainers. Because also, even if you create an issue because you see something that can be improved, a maintainer may not see that as a priority. But again, that's also where communication with maintainers and the community, like, is this an issue that you want me to solve now, or should I focus on other? Yeah.
Right. But I think you're really spot on there. There are so many different types of contributions that are meaningful, and I think without diving into the negative of what isn't a meaningful contribution, I think really the key theme is whatever the motivation is, whether it's a t-shirt or a stipend or the internship payment, the key is making sure that the contribution is an authentic, genuine effort to improve the project. And oftentimes that can mean communicating with the maintainer or other community members to understand what that might be. Now, there's a lot there that I want to unpack to dig more into like the types of contributions. One of the things that I'd like to explore with you, Isabel, is how do people find a project, and what are good ways to get acquainted with a new project?
Yeah, so usually whenever I think about finding a project, the main thing that comes to mind is a project you already use, right? You said you were a web developer for some time, so I bet that you use open source projects, and perhaps you find a bug, or maybe you don't find a bug. Maybe you're just interested in, I really like this project, I have been using it, let me see how I can contribute to it. So projects you already use, open source for libraries that you may use in your code. So that's an example. That's the first thing that comes to mind. A lot of the times when I contribute to other projects that are not part of my community, it's because I just randomly found them. For example, there's a repository that I found the other day from a community, Women Who Code community, and a very simple thing. I tried to access the Slack link in that repository, and it was taking me to a sort of not found page. And I was like, but I'm pretty sure they have a Slack. And then I eventually found a Slack through Twitter and Linktree. And my contribution there was fixing that Slack link so that someone else wouldn't go through the same steps that I went through. I think I lost myself. I lost a bit in my where I was trying to get to.
Sure.
We're
looking at
yeah,
of course. So what is it? You mentioned one good way to find a project is to to look at projects that you already use.
exactly.
What are other good ways to find projects that people might be interested in contributing to if they're new?
Another idea that I usually suggest is, so I participate in Google Summer of Code. And one of the really cool things they have on their website is the page of organizations. Because like you said, organizations sometimes and communities, if they participate in these programs, they are usually have their documentation established, their guidelines, mentorship already set up for potential students. So a lot of the times I just say, hey, if you don't have an idea of projects to use, you can also look into Google Summer of Code website, check organizations that have been accepted, because a ton of organizations apply, but not all get accepted. So if you check those, it means that they probably have projects you can work in, right? Because there's also, there can also be archived projects in certain communities, and communities may no longer be active. And with those, they're active.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right there with you. I've always found looking at the list of organizations and projects participating in Summer of Code and Outreach and other similar programs to a really great filter for communities that are ready to accept new contributors. And it's not a small number of projects participating, right? Everything from astronomy to gaming to compilers and operating systems. Pick a language, pick a stack. It's there, right? So I always encourage people to find what's interesting to you in that subset of projects that are designed to welcome you.
Exactly. And just like you said, that's the communities there, they may be from a lot of different contexts. I've seen communities there for that fight for social causes, nonprofits. I've seen programming languages, frameworks, Flutter, Python usually is there too. Tools that developers use like Jenkins. It's just amazing how you can find there so many open source projects with so many different motivations. And again, that's where it comes, sometimes people may want to give back to open source through contributing to the tools they use or social causes. It's just fascinating what you can learn just from going there.
Absolutely. And I always enjoy it because it's a great way to find something at the intersection of welcoming and interesting and sort of a stretch assignment in terms of, oh, I've not worked with this technology before, or, oh, I've not used this technology in this way. So, okay, let's say I, as a new contributor, have sort of found a project or a few projects that I'm interested in contributing to. What are ways to get acquainted with those projects to start figuring out how I can help them?
Yeah. So right now I'm trying to remember how it was when I got into an ETB community, because I remember that I tried to apply with that same organization in 2016. I wasn't accepted and I eventually disappeared. I really didn't know what to do with this open source concept. I disappeared. And then 2018, I had already contributed to 24 pull requests event, but when I wanted to apply again in 2018, I went again to the same community because I just really identified myself with the mission of helping women in technology. So I went there and, this was the second time. What could be different here? And I think I was more open to see, okay, how does this community work? So I remember at the time we used Slack and I would just see this conversation from different contributors. So I think one great way to try to understand how a project or a community works is getting to their communication channel. See how often they speak, see how they speak to each other. Do they follow the code of conduct? Are they really beginner friendly? Do they answer questions from newcomers? From beginner level to advanced level. So that I think it's a great way to get to know the community, for example, before starting to contribute, because you can also get a lot of context clues of, okay, what are they trying to get at? What are their priorities? So, perhaps if I contribute to the priorities they have, I'll get a contribution faster because that's what they're looking for in the moment.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. I think you're spot
yeah,
on. Like finding where they communicate and just walking up to the watering hole and just tuning in to hear what are their values, what are they interested in, how do they
exactly.
interact with each other.
Exactly. I would lurk a lot in the beginning.
Yeah,
I remember that then when I was accepted and I was talking with one of the admins, she would say, you also lurked a little bit until I ever saw you speak. And in fact, the first time I tried to speak was in private. And then I understood that, oh, no, actually I have to speak in public. Yeah, and that's just these things that you learn about a community. And before I ever contributed with code, I already knew how the community worked.
mm-hmm.
Now, not all projects have these communication channels, right? Because it depends on the size of the project. Is it within an organization or is it just from a single maintainer, for example? So if we look at those examples, the first thing that comes to mind is documentation. That's what it's there for, right? And that's what I also try to pass as a message usually when I think about the difference between an open source environment and a work environment. You don't have someone to just pull aside and ask, hey, how does this work? So the nature of open source is a lot of transparency in communication. So that's where the communication channels are important for. But if you don't have those, there's always documentation. In fact, even if you have the communication channels, you also have documentation. Um, and also looking at the code, looking at pull requests and issues, see how the maintainer communicates with contributors, looking at the issues and try to understand what is the roadmap, what are the priorities again. And this can also be in the documentation. So all these things will help you, if you're a new contributor, to get acquainted with the project. And I think, yeah, I would advise anyone, if you want to start looking at documentation and also start looking at, pull requests and see what are the checks that I need if I open a pull request, how is the communication, contribution guidelines, of course, contribution guidelines and code of conduct, if there's one, the README. Yeah, and contribution guidelines is very important because it will give you the steps that the maintainer is expecting you to follow to get a successful contribution. So all of these signs are there. Yeah, all of these signs are there that a newcomer can pick up.
Yeah, I think you've laid out a whole slew of signals and places that new contributors can look to get a sense of how the community operates and how to best contribute. So let's say that I, as a new contributor, I found some projects. I've been lurking in their issue tracker or their IRC or Slack, and I've whittled it down to like, okay, here's the project I want to contribute to. What are some ways to start figuring out like, well, what kind of contribution might be valuable for this project?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned before, it's if a project has a roadmap, right? If it has a roadmap, so, and what I mean by roadmap is a group of items, group of tasks that perhaps the maintainer wants to communicate to the community. Hey, these are the next priorities. Maybe I want to move documentation from Wiki to Docusaurus. Maybe I want to change the continuous integration, continuous deployment tool to another tool. Or maybe I want to build this X feature. So that's the first thing to, I think, to try to find issues that you could contribute to, and that will get you to finish that contribution in time, right? Because maintainers will be thinking of that. I remember that during this Oktoberfest, there was someone who created a couple of issues, and I told them specifically, this issue is okay, but you created this other issue that seems so much important right now for the project.
Mm-hmm.
It would really improve the navigation in the website. So I said, hey, instead of working on this one, why don't you work on this first one too? Or why don't we focus our efforts here? And then another thing that I also ask people is to help us review pull requests. And one thing
Mm,
that I tried to manage recently is, okay, there's this pull request that I think can be merged faster than others, and probably will require uh, less work than others to review and to test and to make sure that, okay, the contributor fixes these changes requested. Um, so yeah, that's basically what comes from my mind. It's looking
yeah,
what the project is looking for next. However, there may not be a roadmap. So if
right,
that's the case, you have the issues tab
right.
for the project. Right? You have the issues that are open, and perhaps there's a label for the issue saying that it's available, or just the fact that it's unassigned, perhaps it already means, okay, this is ready to be picked up. And again, there's multiple ways of managing issues and repositories. For example, in our community, there was a time that we would use a label just saying priority,
Mm,
low, high, medium. So there's a lot of things you can look into. Um, yeah, and where the maintainers focusing their efforts and where conversations are focusing in. Does that make sense?
yeah, that all makes sense to me. And I think you've highlighted a lot of signals that people can look for to that maintainers and communities will put out there for people to figure out, like, oh, this is what they're looking for. Um, other things that come to mind are the good first issues tag or first timers
Yes.
only tags, which are great ways to filter. Now, one thing that you said that I think is really important for new contributors to think about and consider is, not all projects are there's a great deal of variability between projects, and
Mm,
there are projects that are solo maintainers. There are
yeah.
projects that are large communities that are quite vibrant. Um, and all of those projects are interesting and worthy of support, but the way that one engages with them may be very different.
Yeah.
Um, the solo maintainer, and for instance, is going to be particularly sensitive to issues and contributions that are well formed, right? That where
Mm,
here's all
mhm.
the information, I've served up my contribution as complete as I possibly can, so that you, as a solo maintainer, don't have to do a bunch of extra work to try to figure out, can I merge this? Does this pass the test? What problem is this solving? Uh, and so those are
Perfect.
those are really important things to keep in mind. Uh,
Yeah.
so they're the signals, the explicit signals that projects put out there for new maintainers. I'm wondering if I think you've hinted or touched on this a little bit already, but just to get focused on it, what are some of the contributions that somebody can make uh, for a project that maybe the project doesn't even know they need? Just one example to get you started. I think about, like, if there's an error or a mistake or something outdated in the install documentation or the new contributor documentation, well, that's a great place to start. What other things might
Yeah.
somebody look for as sort of unexpected contributions for a maintainer?
Uh, I will have to say right now, review pull requests. Now, I have this caveat where not all communities work the same way. Not all project maintainers are looking for the same thing. In fact, I've heard once, a maintainer that wasn't really a fan of people just reviewing pull requests because The word they used at the time was like something like karma on GitHub. I think it's something with, if you review a pull request, you get the green tick on your contribution graph. Now, in the community, I mean, we really encourage this because everyone that is there right now, even the admins, we're doing this on a volunteer time. And I'm not specifically a front-end developer, so there's very little I can do with regards to reviewing front-end pull requests. So in my community specifically, I really push for people to help each other. And I have seen this amazing collaboration during Hacktoberfest in a specific project for our open source website, where I actually told them like, hey, did you know you could review pull requests? And two people were contributing to issues that were related. So basically this person needed this issue to be solved so that they could continue. And I've seen this at least like with two pair of people. And yeah, so right now I would say reviewing pull requests is super helpful because we have multiple projects. So, if you come in with some front-end knowledge that I don't have, please come in and help. You can also come in and help with triaging. So when people create issues, these issues may be valid or not. And usually the maintainer will decide that, maintainer and the community together. And imagine that someone reports a bug. That bug, the issue description, just like you said, may not have enough information for the maintainer to, be able to say, oh yeah, this is valid. Perhaps the maintainer has to reproduce the bug, and perhaps there aren't steps for that bug to be reproduced. So for example, if you come in and you find the same bug, you search with keywords for an issue that, is reporting the same thing you want to report, and you find it, that it's already created, you can complete the information there. You can add the comments and say, oh yeah, I also went through this issue and these are the steps that I used. This is the device that I used. And, basically, and perhaps tag the maintainer saying, oh, this is actually valid. Here's a video of this bug showing up. So this is also, air quotes invisible type of contribution, but that can be so helpful. For example, sometimes I receive emails with every time someone texts me or the projects that I maintain. And whenever I go to that email thread and I see that someone else already resolved it, because I have some people who help with maintaining the repositories. It's awesome. I can just mark it as thread and forget about it. And it's less energy that I'm spending as a maintainer, on my spare time to triage something. So helping triage is amazing. And yeah, if I can say, imagine you're a tester, you're not a developer. You can test a deployed version of the app, find bugs, test it like, with multiple edge cases, find bugs and report them. Report them with good issue description that, if a developer comes, can just pick up the issue and work on fixing it. So that's also like a invisible type of contribution. I say invisible because it may not be visible on the contribution graph, but it helps a ton the maintainers. Yeah, these are some that come to my mind.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you highlight sort of the invisible contributions. Often when you think about contributing to open source, the first thing that most people think about is contributing code. Increasingly, we're talking about contributing documentation and tests as well, and that's all very valuable. But it's so important to highlight that open source takes all types and takes all types of contributions. Projects need help with community management sometimes, or organizing events sometimes, and those may not necessarily get you that green box on your contribution graph, but those are all valuable contributions. I think one of the other things that I know is particularly relevant in some of the mentorship programs like Summer of Code and Outreachy and Google Code, not only can you contribute to the project, lines of documentation, code, changes like that, but shoot, if you've been lurking in a community's Slack or IRC for a while, chances are you're going to see other new contributors who are asking questions And if you've got an answer for those questions, if you can help other new contributors get from, maybe not 0 to 60, but 0 to 15 or 30, just to get started, that's really lightening the load for the other community members who have pretty consuming issues that they need to work through on behalf of the community.
Exactly.
So being just another helpful community member is also just a wonderful way to contribute. Now, we did a survey that I mentioned a little earlier, a survey of maintainers, and we specifically asked them, what do you need help with? And it was a multiple choice option. It wasn't free form. So we gave them a set of choices, and it was not surprising, the results necessarily, but they were overwhelming in sort of how clear the signal is that they were sending. We found that 90% of maintainers want help with their documentation.
Mm.
So, if you find that README has a problem, or the install of the contributing guide, or any of those things, those are all really valuable places to contribute. Further, to your point about not all issues necessarily have all the information in them necessary to reproduce a bug or to resolve the issue, 80% of the maintainers we surveyed want help triaging issues, triaging and addressing issues. And that could take the form of, wandering through an issue queue and saying, hey, I see here's this issue template, and I see there's this issue that you filed. There are a few more details. Could you provide this additional information so that we can appropriately address this issue? Just that really basic prompt of other community members to then make their own contributions more fully formed for the maintainer or the committers. That's, again, 80% of maintainers want help with that. Now, to your point, Isabel, also, not all communities want that. So it's an important thing to be sensitive to, but it is more often than not something that people are looking for assistance with.
And also to your point of people helping each other on, if I'm lurking for some time, I probably already know the answer to something. And maybe the answer, if people are asking enough times, maybe it should be on documentation.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I could totally see why people want documentation. Makes total sense, because it's also things that can be written, searchable, and it can just reduce time of someone having to ask, how do you do this in this project? And if it's already in the documentation, you don't have to wait for someone to answer you. So yeah, there's a lot of these things that can just be, if we connect the dots, something that is asked a lot of times. We even we created an FAQ for common asked questions. So we can just, if someone is asking a very common question, we can just give it a link. So give them the link, and yeah, they don't have to wait, and other people will know, oh, I can give this link to the next person that asks the very same thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that if you see a question coming up again and again, it probably belongs in the documentation somewhere. And that's the kind of contribution that a person could certainly make. So we're winding down in terms of this conversation here. Before we close it out, there are two things that I want to make sure we get around to. First of all, Isabel, I think you mentioned wanting to talk a little bit more about the programs that are out there for people to participate in.
Yes. So again, the first time I contributed to open source was through 24 pull requests. That's where I did my first contribution. I basically added a job boards website that I knew wasn't present in a repository that was all about resources to find jobs. I started with 24 pull requests, but then I tried Google Summer of Code. In fact, I was trying Outreachy, but they had a specific line there saying, I think it was one of the communities, if you can apply to Google Summer of Code, please apply through that. Because Google Summer of Code has a restriction for participants have to be students, have to be studying, and outreach, it doesn't have, as far as I know, doesn't have that limitation, but it targets underrepresented groups in technology. So I applied through Google Summer of Code. So Google Summer of Code, Outreachy, these two are programs where they happen during a certain period of time where someone might collaborate with the community and earn some stipend for their work in open source. Another event, of course, Hacktoberfest. And I've also seen communities trying to create their own programs. In fact, the community, I mean, we sometimes try to create programs. There was also Google Coding, which is really sad that it ended, which was for teenagers. And I was actually a mentor there. And I really loved how the whole idea of Google Coding, there was 5 or 6 categories of contribution, right? Code, quality assurance, documentation, outreach and research. And I'm
Design
probably
was in
missing.
there.
Which one?
I think design might have been in there too.
Design, yes, design. By the way, I have to turn on the light because this is just too dark.
Yeah, much better.
Oh yes, Google Coding, but that doesn't exist anymore. So I just wanted to give a shout out to that. Yeah, and other programs. Yeah, communities try to create their own programs. I've seen that happen. There's also Girl Script of Code, Rails Summer of Code. Yeah, there's a lot of programs that they try to incentivize people to contribute to open source. However, I would say, don't limit yourself to those, because usually there's a selection process. And in open source, there shouldn't be selection process. If you have something to contribute, you find a place to contribute, and you give your contribution to the project, and you contribute that way. Does that answer your question about?
Absolutely. And I think there's no bad time to start trying to contribute to open source. So certainly, I don't think folks should wait for a program or to get accepted into a program. One of the things that is really helpful for the programs though is for folks who may feel a little overwhelmed with the choices that are out there, maybe need a helping hand to walk them through some of these things, or folks who just literally cannot afford the time to volunteer this kind of thing. That's where some of those programs are really important, because some of them come with payment, right? Outreachy is an internship. Summer of Code comes with a stipend. And so those are, not all of us have the luxury of free time, but contributing to open source is such an edifying process that, if somebody out there is listening who just wonders, like, where am I going to find the time to do this? Well, those programs are for you in particular, because they can provide resources so that you can afford to invest the time into open source. So before we wrap up here, I would love to give you an opportunity, Isabel, to tell us a little bit about the organization that you work with. You've mentioned Anita B a few times. Do you want to, is there anything you want to say about them?
Yeah, sure. Every time someone comes to me and asks, oh, I really want to get started with open source, but I haven't found a project or an issue yet to contribute. And I always ask them, do you mind contribution to, do you want the contribution to be to a project that you really like, or you don't mind about it, and you just want to learn, for example, how to do a contribution start to finish, right? Create a pull request and talking with maintainers. So Anita B open source, we try to be as beginner friendly as we can. And again, this always depends on people. A community is made of people. And I can say that a lot of the people who help the community, our community members and ambassadors that help reviewing pull requests, they are very friendly. Just go there and check, AnitaB-org is the organization on GitHub. And basically we have projects that their aim is to help this mission of helping women finding their potential in tech. We have a little app for mentorship. We have an app that is actually to help us with doing our little programs outside of those ones that are Google Summer of Code or Oktoberfest. We try to have our little programs that we do within the community. So yeah, I would recommend this community really if you want to start doing contributions in a fail-safe environment. That's what I mostly want. It's for people to get started, know what they can do in open source and all the possibilities. And yeah, and you don't have to stick with the community. You can contribute to other projects as long as you understand that you can give a lot to open source projects, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing a little more about the organization. It is a great place for people to get started. So closing us out a little bit, we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the motivations behind contributions. We're in the middle of Hacktoberfest. That motivation for many right now is t-shirts, but it's also just a good excuse to focus on open source during the month of October. In terms of just in review, in terms of finding projects, getting acquainted with them, it's really great to look at, of course, Hacktoberfest has their own index of projects that are participating. Outside of Hacktoberfest, it never hurts to look at the projects and organizations that are participating in some of the other programs like Summer of Code and Outreachy, because those projects are, by being in those programs, they have already done a lot of the work to be beginner friendly. Once you find those projects, start lurking, listen in on their Slack or their IRC and just get a sense of how they operate. Look for their contributing guide, look through their issues tracker, look at the roadmap if they have one, just to find your footing. And the key in contributing to open source, to make sure it's a meaningful contribution is just the authentic and genuine effort to make the project better for other people. And if you're not sure if a contribution will do that, just ask. Once you've been in the chat for long enough, or you don't even need to wait, really. You can just say like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. Would this be valuable? Do you have any other guidance for me? And people tend to be more than happy to assist with that kind of thing. In terms of looking at good first places to start, looking at the available issues, good first issues tags, first timers only type tags. There might be issues that are really ready for resolving already. Or maybe in the process of getting acquainted with the project, you found some gaps in their documentation or some typos. That's an opportunity to contribute. Also, one of the other things we spoke about was looking at the issues that are already in there, and maybe there are issues or pull requests that could be a little more fully formed to make it a little easier on the maintainer to process those. So helping to triage and flesh out those existing issues and pull requests and other valuable contributions. I feel like I have to reiterate, 90% of maintainers want help with their documentation, and 80% of maintainers want help with that triage. So there's, you got to get familiar with the community you've wandered into. It's not 100%, but by and large, those are things that are very reliably areas that one can help. And, we also talked about just being a good community member. If you see somebody else who's a new contributor who's going through something that you've already figured out, jump in. You don't need to be a senior member of a community to help the other community members. So this has been a fabulous conversation, Isabel. I'm so grateful for your time today. Before we close it out, where can people find you online?
So interesting. I guess you can find me on Isabel CMD Costa on Twitter, and then there will be a link from our website, and then you can find it all.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Every time we speak is a joy, and I hope we've provided some value for everybody who's tuned in today and for the replays. All right.
I hope that too.
Awesome. Have a great evening, Isabel.